A homeless woman broke into a black family's kitchen at night. When their shy 8-year-old son saw her eyes, everyone was shocked by what he did. The kitchen faucet dripped in the darkness. Drip, drip, drip. 8-year-old Michael rolled over in his bed, clutching his worn teddy bear closer. Something wasn't right. Through the thin walls of their modest Portland home, he heard the unmistakable sound of kitchen cabinets opening and closing. His digital clock read 11:47 p.m. Mom and Dad always went to bed at 10:30. Always. Michael sat up, his heart pounding against his ribs. The stuffed bear, Mr. Snuggles, remained pressed against his chest as his bare feet touched the cold wooden floor. His room, decorated with his own crayon drawings and a few action figures from the dollar store, felt different in the darkness. Another cabinet closed downstairs. "Dad," he whispered into the darkness. No answer. The hallway stretched longer than usual as Michael crept toward his parents' room. Their door was closed, and he could hear his father's familiar snoring. They were definitely asleep. More sounds from the kitchen. The refrigerator door opening. Glass clinking. Michael's legs trembled as he approached the top of the stairs. The house creaked under his weight, each step a thunderous announcement of his presence to whoever was below. Halfway down, he froze. A shadow moved across the kitchen floor, visible through the gap under the door. His fingers gripped Mr. Snuggles tighter. He should wake up his parents. That's what they always told him to do if something was wrong. But curiosity pulled him forward, one silent step at a time. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, a thin slice of yellow light spilling into the dark hallway. Michael pressed his eye to the gap, and his breath caught in his throat. An old woman sat at their kitchen table. Her gray hair was matted and dirty, partially hidden under a worn wool hat. Multiple layers of tattered clothing hung from her thin frame. Her wrinkled hands cupped a glass of water, and she stared into it as if it held answers to questions Michael couldn't imagine. He must have made a sound because her head snapped up, eyes meeting his through the crack in the door. Michael stumbled backward, nearly dropping Mr. Snuggles. "It's all right, child," the woman said softly. Her voice was gentle, like his grandmother's had been. "I won't hurt you." Michael stood frozen, heart racing. The woman remained seated, hands still wrapped around the glass of water. She didn't move toward him or make any sudden movements. "My name is Rose," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to be a teacher in Chicago. I'm sorry for coming into your home, but it's very cold outside tonight." Michael pushed the door open slightly wider. "We have a security system," he said, trying to make his voice sound brave despite his trembling lips. Mrs. Rose smiled sadly. "The back door was unlocked, dear. Your parents should be more careful about that." Michael stepped fully into the kitchen. Mr. Snuggles held protectively in front of him. The kitchen light cast long shadows across the familiar space. His mom's coffee maker sat on the counter, where it always did. His dad's newspaper was still folded on the table where the strange woman sat. "Are you homeless?" The question tumbled out before he could stop it. His mother always said it wasn't polite to ask such direct questions, but the words escaped anyway. "Yes," Mrs. Rose answered simply. "I am." Michael moved closer, drawn by something in her eyes. They were kind eyes, tired but gentle, like his school librarian's eyes when she helped him find books during recess, when the playground felt too overwhelming. "Are you hungry?" he asked, remembering his mother's other lesson about helping people in need. "A little," Mrs. Rose admitted, "but I don't want to take your family's food." Michael set Mr. Snuggles on the counter and went to the cabinet where his mom kept his favorite hot chocolate. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the mix and a mug. "I can make hot chocolate," he offered. "Mom says it helps when you're cold." Mrs. Rose watched as Michael carefully measured the powder into the mug and added hot water from the dispenser. He'd done it hundreds of times, but never for a stranger in the middle of the night. "You're very kind," she said as he placed the steaming mug in front of her. "What's your name?" "Michael," he answered, retrieving Mr. Snuggles from the counter. "This is Mr. Snuggles." Mrs. Rose wrapped her weathered hands around the warm mug. "It's nice to meet you both, Michael and Mr. Snuggles. You know, I used to have a class pet bear when I taught 3rd grade. The students named him Professor Barrington." Michael giggled despite his nervousness. "That's a funny name?" "It was," Mrs. Rose smiled, taking a small sip of the hot chocolate. The children loved him. We used him to teach about responsibility and caring for others. What happened to him? Mrs. Rose's smile faded slightly. I had to leave him behind when things changed. Before Michael could ask what she meant, the kitchen light suddenly blazed to full brightness. His father stood in the doorway, his mother right behind him, both of their faces masks of shock and fear. "Michael, get away from her!" his father shouted, rushing forward. "No, Dad, wait." Michael stepped between his father and Mrs. Rose. "She's nice. She was a teacher." His mother had already grabbed the phone. "I'm calling the police." "Please." Mrs. Rose stood slowly, her hands raised. "I understand. I'll leave right now. I'm so sorry for frightening you." Michael could hear the wind howling outside. His weather app had said it would be below freezing tonight. He clutched Mr. Snuggles tighter and did something he'd never done before. He raised his voice to his parents. "She'll freeze. We can't make her leave." Tears welled up in his eyes. "She's drinking hot chocolate with me and Mr. Snuggles. She's not bad." His parents exchanged uncertain looks. His mother's finger hovered over the phone's keypad. His father's defensive stance softened slightly as he looked more closely at the elderly woman who had yet to make any threatening moves. Mrs. Rose spoke quietly, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I was a teacher for 30 years in Chicago. I can show you my old ID if you'd like. I know this is inappropriate and frightening, finding a stranger in your home. I'm not dangerous, just desperate. The shelters are all full because of the cold snap." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind. Michael looked up at his parents with pleading eyes, still standing protectively in front of Mrs. Rose. His mother lowered the phone slowly. "We should at least check if she's telling the truth, James," she said to his father. "We can't just send her out to freeze," Michael finished, his voice small but determined. His father ran a hand over his face, conflict clear in his expression. "Ma'am, do you have that ID you mentioned?" Mrs. Rose nodded and carefully reached into one of her many layers, producing a battered wallet. She withdrew a plastic card and handed it to Michael's father with shaking fingers. The family huddled together, examining the ID card under the bright kitchen light. There she was, years younger but unmistakable, listed as a teacher at Lincoln Elementary School in Chicago. "I can leave first thing in the morning," Mrs. Rose offered. I saw the unlocked door, and I've been walking for so long in the cold." Michael's mother set the phone down completely and moved toward the cabinet where they kept extra blankets. His father's shoulders relaxed slightly, though concern still creased his forehead. "Mom?" Michael asked hopefully. She pulled out their warmest spare blanket. "We'll figure something out in the morning. For tonight." She looked at her husband, who gave a slight nod. "For tonight, you can sleep on our couch, Mrs. Rose." Michael smiled for the first time since coming downstairs, hugging Mr. Snuggles close to his chest. Sometimes, he thought, the scariest moments could turn into something else entirely. Something unexpected. Something kind. Morning light filtered through the living room windows, casting long shadows across Mrs. Rose's sleeping form on the couch. Michael sat on the bottom step of the stairs, still in his pajamas, watching her chest rise and fall beneath the thick blanket his mother had provided. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, along with the hushed voices of his parents. "We need to call social services as soon as they open," his father was saying. "There have to be resources, shelters, something." "I already tried calling the downtown shelter," his mother replied. "They're completely full because of the cold snap. Said they've been turning people away for days." Michael hugged Mr. Snuggles closer, listening to the worry in his parents' voices. On the couch, Mrs. Rose stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She seemed confused for a moment before remembering where she was. "Good morning," Michael said softly. Mrs. Rose sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. "Good morning, Michael. And good morning to you too, Mr. Snuggles." His parents appeared in the kitchen doorway, his mother holding a steaming mug of coffee. "Would you like some coffee, Mrs. Rose? And maybe some breakfast?" "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose any further." Mrs. Rose began folding the blanket with trembling hands. "I should get going." "Going where?" Michael asked, his voice small. Before she could answer, Mrs. Rose's hands began shaking more violently. She dropped the blanket, her face going pale. Are you okay? Michael's mother rushed forward. I need my medication, Mrs. Rose admitted, her voice weak. I'm diabetic. I haven't had my insulin in a while. Michael's father grabbed his car keys from the hook by the door. We need to get you to the emergency room. No. Mrs. Rose's voice was sharp with fear. No hospitals. I can't afford it. That's how I lost everything in the first place. Medical bills. Michael watched his parents exchange worried glances. His mother disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of orange juice. Drink this for now, she said firmly. James, call Dr. Martinez. Maybe she can help. Michael moved to sit beside Mrs. Rose while his father made the call. He noticed how her hands shook as she sipped the juice. Does it hurt? He asked. Mrs. Rose managed a small smile. Not exactly. It's more like feeling very weak and dizzy, like when you spin around too much, but worse. His father returned, phone still in hand. Dr. Martinez can see you in an hour. She has a sliding scale payment system. I don't have any money, Mrs. Rose whispered. We'll figure something out, Michael's mother said. Right now, we need to make sure you're okay. An hour later, they sat in Dr. Martinez's small office. Michael had insisted on coming along, clutching Mr. Snuggles as the doctor examined Mrs. Rose. Your blood sugar is dangerously low, Dr. Martinez said, frowning at the test results. How long have you been without insulin? 3 weeks, Mrs. Rose admitted. When my last vial ran out. Dr. Martinez shook her head. You could have died. Let me make some calls. There are programs that can help with medication costs. While the doctor stepped out, Michael's father paced the small exam room. Mrs. Rose, we need to know more about your situation. How did you end up? On the streets? She smoothed her tattered skirt. I taught 3rd grade in Chicago for 30 years. Had a small pension, some savings. Then I got sick. Really sick. Cancer. She touched her left side. The treatment worked, but the bills, they took everything. My house, my savings, my pension barely covers the payments I still owe. When I couldn't afford rent anymore, Michael reached out and took her hand. It felt cold and fragile in his warm grip. Dr. Martinez returned with several papers and a small bag. I have 3 months' worth of samples here. And these are applications for medical assistance programs. Will help you fill them out before you leave. Thank you, Mrs. Rose whispered, tears in her eyes. Back at home that afternoon, Michael sat at the kitchen table doing his homework while his parents made more calls. Mrs. Rose had fallen asleep on the couch again, the new insulin and proper food helping her recover. The waiting list for senior housing is 8 months, his mother said, hanging up the phone. And even then, she'd need proof of income. What about her pension? His father asked. I'll go to medical bills, she said. And she's right. The shelters are all at capacity. Michael looked up from his math worksheet. She could stay here. His parents stopped talking, looking at him with surprise. Michael, honey, it's not that simple, his mother began. Why not? We have the couch. And she helps me with homework. She was a teacher, remember? Son, we barely know her, his father said gently. But she'll die if we make her leave. Michael's voice rose, causing Mrs. Rose to stir on the couch. She's sick, and it's cold, and she's nice, and she likes Mr. Snuggles, and SHHHH. His mother moved to his side, wrapping an arm around him. We're not going to just throw her out, okay? We'll figure something out. A knock at the front door made them all jump. Michael's father opened it to find their neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, standing there with a concerned look. James, I don't mean to pry, but I saw you all at Dr. Martinez's office today. Is everything okay? I noticed someone sleeping on your couch through the window. Michael watched his father's face tighten. Everything's fine, Linda. We're just helping someone in need. Well, you should be careful. You know there have been break-ins in the neighborhood lately. And with Michael to think about. Mrs. Rose isn't a burglar. Michael shouted from the kitchen. She's sick and needs help. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened. You're letting a homeless person stay here? With your child? Thank you for your concern, Michael's father said firmly, already closing the door. We have it under control. When he turned back, Mrs. Rose was standing in the living room doorway. I should go. I'm causing problems for your family. No. Michael ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Please don't go." His parents looked at each other for a long moment, having one of those silent conversations that Michael could never quite understand. Finally, his mother sighed. "Mrs. Rose, would you like some tea? We need to talk about some things." They gathered around the kitchen table, Michael refusing to leave despite his parents' attempts to send him to his room. Mrs. Rose's hands were steady now as she held her teacup, the day's medication having helped significantly. "We can offer you the couch," Michael's father said slowly. "Temporarily, until we can find a better solution. But we need to establish some ground rules." "I understand completely," Mrs. Rose nodded. "And I'll help however I can. I can cook, clean. You can help me with homework," Michael added excitedly. "She was a teacher, remember?" His mother smiled slightly. "That would be nice. But Mrs. Rose, you have to promise to take your medication regularly. And we'll need to work together to find a more permanent solution." "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Rose's voice cracked. "I never expected." "Nobody expects to end up in your situation," Michael's father said quietly. "But we can't just look away." Michael beamed, hugging Mr. Snuggles tight. "Can we show Mrs. Rose my room? I want her to see my drawings." His mother laughed softly. "After dinner, honey? Right now, I think we should all help get the living room set up properly if Mrs. Rose is going to be staying for a while." As they worked together to make the couch more comfortable, adding pillows and organizing a small space for Mrs. Rose's few belongings, Michael noticed how his parents' tense shoulders gradually relaxed. Mrs. Rose moved slowly but purposefully, her face showing both gratitude and determination. That night, as his mother tucked him into bed, Michael asked, "We did the right thing, didn't we?" She kissed his forehead. "Sometimes the right thing is also the hard thing, baby. But yes, I think we did." Michael fell asleep clutching Mr. Snuggles, knowing that downstairs Mrs. Rose was safe and warm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He'd heard his parents whispering about bills and neighbors and complications. But for now, in this moment, everything felt right. The first week with Mrs. Rose brought changes to the household routine. Michael came downstairs that Monday morning to find her already awake, helping his mother make breakfast. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and warmth. "Good morning, Michael," Mrs. Rose said, flipping a piece of French toast. "I hope you like breakfast." Michael climbed onto his usual chair, Mr. Snuggles tucked under his arm. "You can cook." 30 years of making breakfast for my husband before he passed," she replied, placing a perfectly golden piece of French toast on his plate. "And sometimes I'd make treats for my students." His mother watched from the coffee maker, a slight smile on her face. Mrs. Rose insisted on helping. "She's already cleaned up the kitchen." "My way of contributing," Mrs. Rose said softly. "It's the least I can do." Michael took a big bite of French toast. "This is better than Mom's," he declared, then quickly added, "Sorry, Mom." His mother laughed. "No offense taken. Mrs. Rose definitely has a special touch." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Michael's father, already dressed for work, went to answer it. They could hear Mrs. Peterson's voice from the kitchen. "James, the neighborhood association is meeting tonight. We need to discuss the situation." Michael watched Mrs. Rose's shoulders tense as she turned back to the stove, pretending not to hear. "I'll be at work, Linda," his father replied firmly. "And there's nothing to discuss. Have a good day." When he returned to the kitchen, the atmosphere had changed. Mrs. Rose moved quietly, efficiently cleaning up her cooking space. "Perhaps I should stay in today," she said, to avoid causing more concern. "Nonsense," Michael's mother said. "We're going to get you some proper clothes today. I have some things that might fit, and there's a good thrift store nearby." Michael finished his breakfast quickly. "Can I show Mrs. Rose my drawings before school? Please?" His parents exchanged looks before his mother nodded. "Quickly, honey. The bus will be here soon." Michael practically dragged Mrs. Rose up to his room, Mr. Snuggles bouncing along in his other hand. His walls were covered with crayon drawings, mostly superheroes and animals, with a few attempts at portraits of his family. "This is my art gallery," he announced proudly. "Nobody really sees it except Mr. Snuggles because—" He hesitated, then admitted quietly, "I don't have many friends to invite over." Mrs. Rose studied each drawing carefully. "These are wonderful, Michael. You have a good eye for detail." She pointed to one drawing of a cat. Look how you captured the curve of its tail. That takes observation. Really? Michael brightened. The kids at school say my drawings are weird. Different isn't weird, Mrs. Rose said firmly. Different is interesting. Do you draw at school too? Michael nodded. During recess, sometimes. The playground is too noisy. I had a student like you once, Mrs. Rose said, sitting on the edge of his bed. She preferred quiet activities too. But you know what? She became a famous illustrator. She draws children's books now. The sound of a horn outside interrupted them. That's the bus. Michael grabbed his backpack. Wait, Mrs. Rose called as he reached the door. Would you like to learn some new drawing techniques after school? I used to teach art lessons during lunch breaks. Michael's face lit up. Really? Mom, can I? His mother appeared in the doorway. If Mrs. Rose is offering, I think that's wonderful. But bus now. The school day passed differently than usual. During recess, instead of hiding in his usual corner with his sketchbook, Michael found himself thinking about Mrs. Rose's art lessons. At lunch, when Billy Thompson made fun of Mr. Snuggles peeking out of his backpack, Michael didn't feel the usual sting of shame. He's not just a teddy bear, Michael said clearly. He's an art critic. A few kids giggled, not meanly, but with actual amusement. Sarah Chun even showed him her own stuffed rabbit that she kept hidden in her desk. When he got home, Mrs. Rose was wearing clean clothes, simple things his mother had found at the thrift store, but worlds better than her tattered layers. She had set up a small art station at the kitchen table with paper and various pencils. Your mother found these in the garage, she explained. Real drawing pencils, different hardnesses for different effects. For the next hour, she taught him about shading and perspective. Michael discovered he could make things look round just by understanding where the light hit them. His mother watched from the doorway as he created his first properly three-dimensional apple. That's amazing, honey, she exclaimed. Mrs. Rose, you're a wonderful teacher. He's a wonderful student, Mrs. Rose replied. Observant, patient. Those are rare qualities. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Mr. Wilson from next door. Michael's mother answered. Helen, we're worried, he said without preamble. Having a homeless person in the neighborhood. Property values. Her name is Mrs. Rose, Michael called out, still focused on his drawing. And she's teaching me art. She's a former teacher who fell on hard times, his mother said firmly. And she's our guest. The association meeting tonight. We'll have to proceed without us, she finished. Goodbye, Mr. Wilson. When she returned to the kitchen, Mrs. Rose was already packing up the art supplies. I should go to a shelter. This is causing too much trouble. No. Michael grabbed her hand. You can't leave. I'm learning so much, and you make the best French toast, and... He looked up at his mother pleadingly. His mother put her hands on her hips. Mrs. Rose, sit down. You're not going anywhere. The neighborhood association can discuss paint colors and lawn height all they want. This is our home, our decision. That evening, while his parents were making dinner, Michael showed Mrs. Rose his special project, a detailed drawing of Mr. Snuggles he'd been working on secretly. The shading technique you taught me helped with his fur, he explained proudly. It's excellent work, Mrs. Rose said. You know, art can be very healing. When I first found myself without a home, I would draw in notebooks to stay hopeful. Until I couldn't afford the notebooks anymore. Michael pushed his sketchbook toward her. You can share mine. Tears welled in Mrs. Rose's eyes. You are a very special young man, Michael. The doorbell rang yet again. This time, it was a small group of neighbors, clearly coming from the association meeting. Michael's father opened the door, but didn't invite them in. We've taken a vote, Mrs. Peterson said. The presence of Mrs. Rose, Michael's father corrected, is making people uncomfortable. There are concerns about safety, property values. Show them your drawing, Mrs. Rose whispered to Michael. Michael walked to the door with his latest work. Look what Mrs. Rose taught me today. She was a teacher for 30 years, and now she teaches me art and helps with my homework and makes the best French toast, and she's not scary at all. The neighbors fell silent, looking at the detailed drawing. Sarah Chin's mother spoke up from the back of the group. Sarah mentioned, she said there was a nice lady helping with art at your house. Sarah's been wanting art lessons. Mrs. Rose taught art in Chicago, Michael's mother said. Along with regular subjects, The group shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat. Well, perhaps we were hasty in our concerns. Perhaps, Michael's father agreed. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're about to have dinner. As a family, later that night, as his mother tucked him in, Michael asked, "Are they going to make Mrs. Rose leave?" "No, honey," she kissed his forehead. "Sometimes people just need time to see what we see. And you're helping them see it. How? By being yourself. By showing them your art, your kindness. Change starts small, with one person being brave enough to do what's right." Michael hugged Mr. Snuggles close. Like letting Mrs. Rose stay when she was cold? Exactly like that. His mother smiled. "Now get some sleep. I heard Mrs. Rose mention something about teaching you watercolors tomorrow." As Michael drifted off to sleep, he could hear the murmur of voices downstairs, his parents and Mrs. Rose, talking quietly, planning, finding ways to make this unexpected situation work. He smiled into Mr. Snuggles' fur, knowing that sometimes the best families are the ones you build yourself, one French toast breakfast and art lesson at a time. The community center buzzed with angry voices. Michael pressed his ear against the door, trying to hear what the adults were saying inside. His mother had brought him along, unable to find a sitter on short notice, but insisted he wait in the hallway. "It's a matter of community safety," someone was saying. "We don't know anything about this woman. She was a teacher." Michael's mother's voice rose above the others. "She has documentation. We've verified her background. And what about her medical condition?" Mrs. Peterson's sharp tone cut through. "What happens when she can't afford her medication again? When she has an episode? Around our children?" Michael clutched Mr. Snuggles tighter. He'd seen Mrs. Rose take her insulin shots every day. She never complained, never made a fuss. She just did what she needed to do, then went back to teaching him about watercolors or helping him with his math homework. "The property values in this neighborhood have already dropped 2%, Mr. Wilson's voice boomed. "Just the rumor of a homeless person living here is affecting our investments." "She's not homeless anymore," Michael whispered to Mr. Snuggles. "She lives with us now." The door opened suddenly, and Michael stumbled back. Several neighbors filed out, giving him a wide berth as if homelessness might be contagious. His mother emerged last, her face tight with anger. "Let's go home, honey," she said, taking his hand. "What do they say?" Nothing worth repeating. When they got home, they found Mrs. Rose sitting at the kitchen table with Michael's father, looking through job listings on his laptop. She looked up as they entered, immediately sensing the tension. "The meeting didn't go well, did it?" Michael's mother dropped her purse on the counter with more force than necessary. "They're being ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Maybe I should start looking at shelters again," Mrs. Rose said quietly. "Now that my health is better." "No!" Michael rushed to her side. "You can't leave. Show them what you drew today." Mrs. Rose smiled softly and pulled out a watercolor painting, a beautiful rendition of their kitchen window with the morning light streaming through it. "Just a little practice piece?" "It's beautiful," Michael's father said. "And speaking of your art," Sarah Chin's mother called. She'd like to discuss private art lessons for Sarah. "Really?" Mrs. Rose's eyes widened. "Really?" She said she'd pay market rate for an experienced teacher. Hope flickered across Mrs. Rose's face, but then faded. "I don't know if that's wise, with all the opposition." A knock at the door interrupted them. Michael's father answered it to find Sarah Chun and her mother standing there. "I hope we're not interrupting," Mrs. Chun said. "Sarah hasn't stopped talking about the drawing she saw Michael working on at school. She said Mrs. Rose was teaching him." "Please come in," Michael's mother said, shooting a triumphant look at her husband. Sarah immediately gravitated toward Michael's art supplies spread across one end of the table. "Can you really teach me to draw like that?" she asked Mrs. Rose. "I can teach you the techniques," Mrs. Rose answered carefully. "But you'll develop your own style. Every artist is unique." While the children examined Michael's recent drawings, the adults talked quietly at the other end of the table. Michael caught bits of their conversation. Words like references and credentials and payment terms. "You know the neighborhood association is against this," Mrs. Chun said finally. "But Sarah hasn't shown interest in anything like this before. And your background checks out." "I have all my teaching certificates," Mrs. Rose offered. "They're a bit outdated, but..." "I'm not concerned about certificates," Mrs. Chin smiled. I'm interested in results. And what I see here, she gestured to Michael's drawings, is impressive. They set up a schedule, twice a week after school. As the Chins were leaving, Sarah turned back. Can I bring my stuffed rabbit to draw? Like Michael has Mr. Snuggles? Of course, Mrs. Rose answered. Art is better with friends. The good mood was shattered an hour later when rocks crashed through the living room window. Michael screamed, and Mrs. Rose pulled him away from the flying glass. His father rushed outside, but whoever had thrown them was gone. On one of the rocks was a note. "No homeless here." Michael's mother called the police while his father cleaned up the glass. Mrs. Rose stood in the middle of the living room, shaking. I'll pack my things, she said. I can't let your family be targeted because of me. No, Michael's father said firmly. This is exactly why you need to stay. We don't give in to bullies. The police officer who responded took pictures and notes, but didn't seem optimistic about finding the culprits. After he left, the family huddled in the kitchen, away from the boarded-up window. Maybe we should get security cameras, Michael's mother suggested. Already ordered them, his father replied. They'll be here tomorrow? Mrs. Rose hadn't touched her tea. I never meant to bring such trouble to your home. This isn't trouble you brought, Michael's mother said. This is trouble other people made. There's a difference. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He kept hearing noises, imagining more rocks coming through windows. Around midnight, he crept downstairs with Mr. Snuggles. Mrs. Rose was awake too, sitting on the couch in the dark. Couldn't sleep? She asked softly. Michael shook his head and climbed up beside her. I'm scared they'll come back. Me too, she admitted. But you know what helps with fear? Drawing what scares you. It makes it seem less frightening somehow. She pulled out his sketchbook, and together they drew the broken window, but they added superhero Mr. Snuggles standing guard, wearing a cape and mask. Michael giggled at the sight. See? Not so scary now, Mrs. Rose said. Why do they hate you? Michael asked suddenly. You're nice and you make good breakfast and you teach me things. Mrs. Rose was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes people are scared of things they don't understand. They see someone without a home and they think it could never happen to them. But it can. I had a good job, a house, a normal life. Then I got sick and the bills piled up and suddenly... But you're not homeless now, Michael insisted. You live here, thanks to your family's kindness. But some people think kindness is dangerous. They think helping others means having less for themselves. That's stupid, Michael declared. Helping you made everything better. I can draw now, and Sarah's going to take lessons, and your French toast is the best ever. Mrs. Rose hugged him close. You're very wise for 8 years old. You know that? They stayed up drawing superhero versions of themselves until Michael finally fell asleep on the couch. His parents found them there in the morning. Michael curled up with Mr. Snuggles, Mrs. Rose sitting guard, their superhero drawings spread around them. The next few days brought more challenges. Someone left nasty notes in their mailbox. A few parents at school told their children not to play with Michael. But there were small victories too. Sarah's first art lesson went wonderfully, and her mother told all her friends. 2 more families inquired about lessons. See? Michael said proudly during breakfast. They just needed to know you better. Mrs. Rose smiled as she flipped French toast. Maybe. Or maybe they just needed to see me as a person, not a problem. The doorbell rang, and everyone tensed. But it was just the delivery person with the security cameras. As Michael's father installed them, Mrs. Rose taught Michael how to draw the birds that came to their backyard feeder. Art isn't just about making pretty pictures, she explained. It's about seeing the world differently. Finding beauty in unexpected places. Like finding a teacher in your kitchen? Michael asked. Mrs. Rose laughed, her first real laugh since the window incident. Exactly like that. That afternoon, Michael came home from school to find Mrs. Rose looking pale and shaky. His mother was already on the phone with Dr. Martinez. Her blood sugar crashed, his mother explained. The stress. I'll be fine, Mrs. Rose insisted weakly. Just need to rest. Michael ran to get her juice box from the fridge. They kept them specially for her now. As she sipped it slowly, color returning to her face, he heard more angry voices outside. A small crowd had gathered on their lawn. Signs bobbed in the air. keep our neighborhood safe, and no vagrants allowed. Michael's father stood in the doorway, filming them with his phone. This is harassment, he called out. And it's all being recorded now. Mrs. Rose tried to stand, but Michael's mother gently pushed her back down. Don't you dare, she said. This is your home now. They're the ones who need to leave. Michael took Mrs. Rose's hand. Want to draw some more superheroes? We can give them extra strong powers to fight bullies. Through the window, they could hear the protesters' angry voices. But inside, at the kitchen table, Michael and Mrs. Rose drew their own world. One where kindness was a superpower, and home was wherever you found family. The basement was stuffy and dim as Michael helped Mrs. Rose sort through her small bag of belongings. His mother had suggested organizing everything now that Mrs. Rose had proper storage space, but Michael could tell there was another reason. They were looking for something specific. Are you sure you kept it? His mother asked, holding a flashlight over a worn leather wallet. My teaching credentials were my pride and joy, Mrs. Rose replied, carefully opening a hidden compartment in the wallet. Even when I had to sell everything else, I kept these. Papers emerged from the compartment, yellow with age, but carefully preserved in plastic. Michael held Mr. Snuggles close as Mrs. Rose laid them out on the basement floor. Look, she pointed to a certificate with gold edges. Teacher of the Year, Chicago Public Schools, 1998. Michael's mother picked it up carefully. And these photos? Mrs. Rose's hands trembled as she spread out a collection of faded photographs. They showed a younger version of her in a bright classroom, surrounded by smiling children. More certificates and newspaper clippings joined the display. Local teacher revolutionizes art education. Michael read slowly from one headline. That's you. It was a different life, Mrs. Rose said softly. Before the cancer, before the bills. The basement door opened, and Michael's father called down. The school board representative is here early. Mrs. Rose's hands shook as she gathered the documents. Michael helped her up the stairs, noticing how she gripped the railing tightly. In the living room, a stern-looking woman in a gray suit sat perched on the edge of the couch. Mrs. Rose? I'm Barbara Whitman from the school district. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Rose smoothed her thrift store skirt nervously. We received your application for the teaching assistant position, Ms. Whitman said, consulting her tablet. Your credentials are impressive, but there are concerns about my current situation, Mrs. Rose finished quietly. Yes, the board needs assurance that you're stable. Michael felt anger bubble up in his chest. She is stable. She lives here and teaches art and makes the best French toast and dash. Michael, his mother touched his shoulder gently. Why don't you go upstairs? No, Mrs. Rose said suddenly. Let him stay. He's part of the story, too. She turned to Ms. Whitman. Would you like to see my portfolio? She spread out the certificates and clippings on the coffee table. Ms. Whitman leaned forward despite herself. This program you developed, she pointed to one article, integrating art therapy into standard curriculum. Children learn better when they feel safe expressing themselves, Mrs. Rose explained. Art gives them that outlet. Like superhero Mr. Snuggles, Michael added, holding up a recent drawing. Ms. Whitman's professional mask cracked slightly as she examined the drawing. This is quite good for his age. Your influence? I just teach techniques, Mrs. Rose said. The creativity is all his. And these test scores from your last year teaching. Ms. Whitman pulled up data on her tablet. They were exceptional. Teaching wasn't just my job. Mrs. Rose's voice grew stronger. It was my calling. Cancer took my health for a while. Medical bills took my home, but they couldn't take my ability to teach. A knock at the door interrupted them. Michael's father answered it to find Sarah Chun and her mother, along with 2 other families. Sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Chun said, but we heard about the school board meeting with Mrs. Rose. We wanted to show our support. Sarah thrust forward a piece of paper, a drawing clearly influenced by Mrs. Rose's techniques. Look what she taught me. The other parents stepped forward, speaking over each other. My daughter never showed interest in art before. He's actually excited about learning now. The way she explains things. Ms. Whitman watched this display with raised eyebrows. You've been teaching locally? Just a few private lessons, Mrs. Rose said modestly. To contribute to the household? Contribute? Michael burst out. She made Sarah stop crying about math. And Tommy finally finished a whole drawing without giving up. And dash Michael. His mother warned, but she was smiling. Ms. Whitman spent the next hour reviewing Mrs. Rose's old lesson plans, teaching evaluations, and recent student work. The parents stayed, adding their observations and praise. When Ms. Whitman finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. The board meeting is tomorrow. I think they need to see all of this. After she left, Mrs. Rose sank into a chair, exhausted. The parents thanked her and filed out, leaving promises of support at the board meeting. Are you okay? Michael asked, noticing her hands shaking again. Just tired, dear. It's been a big day. Michael's mother was already getting juice and crackers for Mrs. Rose's blood sugar. As she ate, Michael sorted through the papers still spread across the coffee table. What's this? He held up a photo of a much younger Mrs. Rose accepting an award. The Governor's Award for Educational Excellence, she said, for the art therapy program. We helped so many children work through trauma, learning disabilities, social anxiety. Like me? Michael asked quietly. With being shy? Mrs. Rose smiled. Art has a way of helping us express what we can't say with words. Is that why you drew even when you were... Michael hesitated, then whispered, homeless? Exactly. It helped me remember who I was, even when I had nothing else. Michael's father, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, spoke up. These achievements, these programs you developed, why didn't you tell us all this before? Mrs. Rose looked down at her hands. When you lose everything, you start to doubt everything about yourself. Was I really a good teacher? Did I really make a difference? Or was I fooling myself all along? You weren't fooling anyone, Michael's mother said firmly, pointing to the stack of evidence on the table. This is who you are, who you've always been, and now everyone will know. Michael added excitedly. The school board has to give you the job. Mrs. Rose gathered him into a hug. Oh, sweetheart, it's not that simple. There's still the question of my health, my living situation. You're healthy now, he insisted. And you live here. And you're the best teacher ever. Speaking of health, Michael's mother interjected, it's time for your evening insulin. And then I think we all need rest before tomorrow's board meeting. As Mrs. Rose prepared her injection with practiced ease, Michael gathered up the photos and certificates carefully. Can I keep these in my room tonight? To make copies for the board. I think that's a wonderful idea, his father said. But first, homework. Later that night, unable to sleep, Michael crept downstairs again. He found Mrs. Rose at the kitchen table, drawing by the light of a small lamp. Couldn't sleep? She asked, not looking up from her sketch. Too excited about tomorrow? He climbed onto a chair beside her. What are you drawing? She turned the paper toward him. It was their kitchen, but not as it was now. It showed the room full of children at easels, Mrs. Rose teaching at the front, sunlight streaming through the windows. My dream, she said simply. If the board approves, when, Michael corrected, when they approve, Dad says your qualifications are, impressive. Mrs. Rose smiled. Your father is kind, but there's still so much uncertainty. Is that why you're shaking again? Do you need juice? No, dear. Sometimes we shake from fear as much as low blood sugar. She started a new sketch. Want to help me design a classroom? They spent the next hour drawing their perfect classroom together, adding details like art supply stations and a special corner for Mr. Snuggles to oversee the students. Mrs. Rose taught him how to draw perspective, making the room look three-dimensional. See how the lines all meet at one point? She demonstrated. That's called the vanishing point. It's where everything comes together. Like you coming here? Michael asked. Everything came together when you found our kitchen. Mrs. Rose paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. I was so ashamed that night, she admitted. Breaking in, stealing warmth. I never imagined it would lead to this. Don't be ashamed, Michael said firmly, hugging Mr. Snuggles. You found your vanishing point. A tear slipped down Mrs. Rose's cheek as she pulled him into a hug. How did you get so wise, little one? You taught me, he said simply. Now, can we add a superhero wall to the classroom? They were still drawing when Michael's mother found them at dawn. Plans for their dream classroom spread across the table, hope sketched into every detail. The school board meeting room was packed. Michael sat between his parents in the back row, clutching Mr. Snuggles tightly. Mrs. Rose sat in the front, wearing his mother's best blazer and a determined expression. Next item on the agenda, the board chairman announced the application of Rose Thompson for the teaching assistant position at Lincoln Elementary. Mrs. Peterson stood up immediately. I object. This woman was homeless until recently. She broke into a house. My house, Michael's father called out. And we've already addressed that. The chairman banged his gavel. Please, let's maintain order. Ms. Whitman, your evaluation? Barbara Whitman stood, tablet in hand. Mrs. Thompson's qualifications are exceptional. 30 years teaching experience, numerous awards, innovative programs dash. But she was living on the streets. Someone interrupted. What kind of example is that for our children? Michael felt his face grow hot. He started to stand, but his mother gently pulled him back down. Actually, Ms. Whitman continued firmly, Mrs. Thompson's situation provides an important lesson about resilience and the precarious nature of healthcare in our country. Her descent into homelessness was due to catastrophic medical bills following cancer treatment, not any personal failing. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Michael saw some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Furthermore, Ms. Whitman held up some papers. I have letters from parents whose children have already benefited from Mrs. Thompson's teaching. Sarah Chen's mother reports a complete turnaround in her daughter's interest in both art and mathematics. Sarah, sitting with her mother a few rows ahead, beamed proudly. That's all very nice. Mrs. Peterson stood again. But what about her health? She's diabetic. What if she has an episode during class? I handle my condition responsibly. Mrs. Rose spoke for the first time, her voice steady. I have regular medical care now, proper medication, and a stable living environment. My diabetes is well controlled, thanks to my mom and dad. Michael couldn't help calling out. They helped when nobody else would. Young man, the chairman peered over his glasses. This is a formal meeting. But it's true. Michael broke free from his mother's restraining hand and ran to the front. Mr. Snuggles still clutched tight. Mrs. Rose teaches me every day. She helps me not be scared at school. She shows me how to draw my feelings when I can't say them. And she never, ever has episodes because she takes her medicine and eats proper food now. The room fell silent. Mrs. Rose smiled at him through tears. Michael, she said softly, thank you. But you should dash know. He turned to face the board. You have to see your drawings. And mine. And Sarah's. And all the newspaper articles about her being the best teacher in Chicago. He dumped his backpack on the table, spilling out artwork and old news clippings. The board members leaned forward despite themselves, examining the evidence of both past achievement and present impact. Young man, one board member said, studying a drawing. Did you do this? Mrs. Rose taught me, Michael said proudly. See how the shadows make it look real? And the perspective lines? She teaches me real art things, not just coloring. Sarah Chen suddenly stood up too. She taught me too. I was failing math until she showed me how to draw the problems. Other children began speaking up from around the room. She helped me stop being afraid of reading out loud. My drawings don't look like baby stuff anymore. She never makes fun of anyone's art. The chairman banged his gavel again, but Michael could see him fighting a smile. Mrs. Thompson, he said, your credentials are indeed impressive. But there are concerns about stability. I take full responsibility for Mrs. Rose's housing stability. Michael's father stood. She's part of our family now. She contributes to household expenses through her private art lessons, helps with chores, and has become essential to our home. And her medical care is fully managed. Michael's mother added, also standing. We have documentation from Dr. Martinez about her controlled diabetes. Mrs. Peterson wasn't finished. But what about the property values? The reputation of our school? Oh, shut up, Linda, Mrs. Chun snapped, surprising everyone. My daughter went from hating school to begging to go early for art lessons. That's worth more than your precious property values. The chairman called for order again. Perhaps we should hear from Mrs. Thompson herself. Mrs. Rose stood slowly, her hands steady as she faced the board. I lost everything to cancer and medical debt. My home, my savings, my career, but I never lost my ability to teach. Every day on the streets, I dreamed of being back in a classroom. When I found myself in the Jacksons' kitchen that cold night, I thought I had hit rock bottom. Instead, I found a new beginning. She gestured to Michael. This remarkable boy showed me that second chances are possible. His family proved that kindness still exists. And these students, she smiled at Sarah and the others, reminded me why I fell in love with teaching in the first place. The insurance situation concerns me, one board member said. If you had another health crisis, she's on my company's insurance now, Michael's father interrupted. As a household member, full coverage. Michael watched the board members exchange looks. Ms. Whitman stepped forward again. The children's test scores in Mrs. Thompson's previous teaching positions show remarkable improvement, and the art therapy program she developed has been adopted by schools across Illinois. We have an opportunity here to add an extraordinary educator to our staff. At a fraction of the usual salary, Mrs. Rose added quietly. I'm only asking for a teaching assistant position, a chance to prove myself again. The chairman cleared his throat. Well, I think we've heard enough to take a vote. Board members? Michael held his breath as hands went up. He counted silently, squeezing Mr. Snuggles so tight his arms hurt. Mrs. Rose stood perfectly still, her face a mask of careful hope. By a vote of 6-1, the chairman announced, "We approve the appointment of Mrs. Rose Thompson as teaching assistant at Lincoln Elementary, subject to standard background checks and medical clearance." The room erupted in cheers. Michael launched himself at Mrs. Rose, hugging her tight. "You did it! You did it! We did it!" she corrected, hugging him back. "All of us together." Mrs. Peterson stormed out, but others crowded around to congratulate Mrs. Rose. Sarachin showed her mother the new drawing she'd been working on. Even some of the board members came down to examine the artwork more closely. "I have one condition," Mrs. Rose said suddenly, raising her voice to be heard. Everyone fell silent. "Yes?" the chairman asked. "I want to restart the art therapy program here. Not just regular art classes, but real therapeutic art sessions for children who need extra support. Like the program I ran in Chicago." The chairman looked at his fellow board members, then shrugged. "If you can do it within the existing budget." "I can," she said firmly. "Art doesn't need expensive supplies. It just needs heart." Later that night, after the celebration dinner was over and the house was quiet, Michael found Mrs. Rose in the kitchen, drawing as usual. "What are you making?" he asked, climbing onto his usual chair. She turned the paper to show him. It was a detailed sketch of the school board meeting, capturing the moment of victory. In the drawing, Michael stood proudly next to Mrs. Rose, Mr. Snuggles raised high, like a victory flag. "Our finest moment," she said, adding shading to Mr. Snuggles' fur. "Are you scared about starting work?" Michael asked, noticing a slight tremor in her hands. "Terrified," she admitted. "But you know what? That's okay. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right anyway. Like going to a scary board meeting? Like letting a strange boy and his bear into your heart when you thought your heart was all closed up," she said softly. Michael leaned against her shoulder, watching her add the final touches to the drawing. "Mrs. Rose?" "Yes, dear? I'm glad you found our kitchen that night." She wrapped an arm around him, her voice thick with emotion. "Me too, Michael. Me too." Michael sat at his desk, chewing on his pencil as he stared at the blank paper before him. Around him, his classmates worked on their math problems, but his mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Rose started her new job tomorrow, and he wanted to do something special. Michael, his teacher, Mrs. Adams, approached his desk. "Are you stuck on a problem?" He shook his head. "Can I write a letter instead?" "It's important." Mrs. Adams glanced at his empty worksheet, then at his earnest expression. "What kind of letter?" "For Mrs. Rose. She starts teaching tomorrow, and I want the other kids to know how special she is." His teacher's face softened. The whole school had heard about the board meeting by now. "Tell you what, finish your math first, then you can work on your letter." Michael attacked his math problems with new determination. Mr. Snuggles sat in his lap, offering moral support as he worked through the equations. Mrs. Rose had taught him to draw the problems when they got confusing, turning abstract numbers into concrete shapes. Finally, he flipped his paper over and began to write. "Dear everyone at Lincoln Elementary, tomorrow you're going to meet Mrs. Rose. She's going to be a new teacher here. But she's not just any teacher. She's magic. Not real magic with wands and spells. But she can show you how to draw your feelings when you can't say them out loud. She can make math problems turn into pictures that make sense. She can help you not be scared of things by drawing them into something funny instead. Some people said mean things about Mrs. Rose because she didn't have a home for a while. But that's not her fault. She got sick and the doctors took all her money. But she never stopped being a teacher in her heart. She found our kitchen one cold night when she was looking for somewhere warm. I was scared at first, but then I saw her eyes. They were kind eyes. Teacher eyes. Now she lives with us and makes the best French toast and teaches me art every day. Mrs. Rose says everyone has art inside them. They just need help letting it out. She taught me how to make shadows, make things look real. She taught Sarah Chun how to draw her math problems. She even taught Mr. Snuggles to be a superhero in drawings. Please be nice to her. She gets shaky sometimes because of her diabetes, but she always takes her medicine and eats proper food now. And sometimes her hands shake just because she's nervous, like anyone gets nervous. But she's the bravest person I know. If you give her a chance, she'll show you how to see the world differently. How to make beautiful things out of regular things. How to be brave when you're scared. She's going to make our school better. I know it. Your friend, Michael, and Mr. Snuggles. Mrs. Adams read the letter during lunch break, wiping her eyes when she finished. Michael, this is beautiful. Would you like to read it at morning assembly tomorrow? Michael clutched Mr. Snuggles tighter. Speaking in front of the whole school? His stomach churned at the thought. But then he remembered Mrs. Rose's words. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. Okay, he whispered. But can Mr. Snuggles come too? That afternoon, he raced home to tell Mrs. Rose about the assembly. He found her in his parents' room, trying on different combinations of his mother's clothes. Nothing looks right, she fretted, smoothing down a blouse. I need to look professional. You look like a teacher already, Michael assured her. Want to see what I wrote? He read her the letter. By the end, she was crying but smiling too. Oh, Michael, she pulled him into a hug. What did I do to deserve you? You made really good French toast, he said seriously, making her laugh. His mother appeared in the doorway. Speaking of food, we should go get your new glasses before dinner, Mrs. Rose. Can't have you squinting at the students tomorrow. Michael ran to his room and retrieved his piggy bank. He'd been saving for a new video game, but this was more important. I want to help buy them, he announced, dumping his savings on the kitchen table. Honey, no, Mrs. Rose protested. Your parents are handling it. Please? He pushed the pile of coins and crumpled dollars toward her. You helped me learn to draw. I want to help you see. His mother turned away, but not before Michael caught her wiping her eyes. At the eyeglass store, Michael took his role very seriously. He held up different frames while Mrs. Rose tried them on. These ones, he declared finally, pointing to a pair of simple blue frames. They match your teacher eyes. The optician quickly fitted the frames with Mrs. Rose's prescription. When she put them on, her whole face lit up. I can see everything so clearly now, she marveled, looking around the store. I'd forgotten how sharp the world could be. On the way home, they stopped at the art supply store. Michael's father had insisted on getting Mrs. Rose some proper teaching supplies. She moved through the aisles reverently, touching brushes and papers with her newly steady hands. I never thought I'd be doing this again, she whispered, selecting colored pencils and sketch pads. Planning lessons, choosing supplies. Don't forget stuff for art therapy, Michael reminded her. For helping kids like me. That evening, Mrs. Rose spread her new supplies across the kitchen table, organizing them for her first day. Michael sat with her, helping to sharpen pencils and sort markers by color. Are you nervous about tomorrow? He asked. Terrified, she admitted. But it's a good kind of terrified, like standing at the top of a diving board. I'm scared too, he confessed. About reading the letter at assembly, she put down her pencils and turned to face him fully. Want to draw about it? Together, they sketched the school auditorium, but they filled it with friendly faces and encouraging smiles. They drew Michael at the podium, but gave him a superhero cape like Mr. Snuggles often wore in their pictures. See? Mrs. Rose pointed to the drawing. It's still scary, but we made it our kind of scary. Our kind of scary is better, Michael decided. It has more colors. Later, As his mother tucked him into bed, he asked, "Do you think the other kids will like Mrs. Rose?" "I think they'll love her," his mother said. "Just like we do? Even Mrs. Peterson's kids?" His mother smiled. "Even them. It's hard not to love someone who helps you find your own magic." Michael hugged Mr. Snuggles close. "Mom, I'm glad we didn't call the police that night when we found Mrs. Rose." "Me too, baby." She kissed his forehead. Sometimes the scariest moments bring the best changes. In the middle of the night, Michael crept downstairs again. As expected, Mrs. Rose was at the kitchen table, drawing by lamplight. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, not looking up from her sketch. Too excited, he climbed into his usual chair. "What are you drawing?" She turned the paper to show him. It was their kitchen again, but this time it showed the moment they first met. Michael in his pajamas, clutching Mr. Snuggles, Mrs. Rose at the table with her glass of water. "Our beginning," she said softly. "I was so cold that night, so desperate. I never imagined that you'd become a teacher again, that I'd find a family again." She added a few final touches to the drawing. "Want to help me draw what tomorrow might look like?" They stayed up late, filling pages with possibilities. Mrs. Rose teaching art classes, helping students with math, running therapy sessions with drawing supplies, and understanding smiles. Michael drew himself showing Mr. Snuggles to her students, explaining how art could make scary things less frightening. "Mrs. Rose?" he asked as they finished their last drawing. "What if some kids are mean?" About before." She thought for a moment. "Then we'll draw about that too. Sometimes the best way to fight meanness is to create something beautiful." Michael nodded sleepily. "Like how we turned Mr. Snuggles into a superhero when we were scared." "Exactly." She gathered him into a hug. "Now, you should try to sleep. We both have big speeches tomorrow." As he climbed the stairs, Michael looked back at Mrs. Rose, still sitting at the kitchen table where he'd first found her. She was checking her insulin kit, laying out her clothes for tomorrow, organizing her new art supplies. All the normal things that had seemed impossible just months ago. "Good night, Mrs. Rose," he called softly. She looked up, her new glasses catching the lamplight. "Good night, my brave artist." Michael fell asleep holding Mr. Snuggles close, dreaming of tomorrow, of scary things turned beautiful through art, of kind eyes behind new blue glasses, of second chances found in unexpected places like dark kitchens on cold nights. The first week of Mrs. Rose's teaching position transformed Lincoln Elementary in ways nobody expected. Michael watched from his usual spot on the playground as more and more kids gravitated toward the art therapy corner she'd set up in the library during lunch breaks. "Can you show me how to draw my dog?" Tommy Peterson asked, clutching his sketchbook. "He died last week, and I miss him." Mrs. Rose pulled up a chair. "Of course. Sometimes drawing the things we miss helps us remember them better." Michael noticed that even Mrs. Peterson had stopped making comments when she dropped Tommy off at school. Instead, she lingered sometimes, watching through the library window as her son learned to capture his memories on paper. "Your mom's pretty cool," Sarah Chun told Michael during recess. "I mean, Mrs. Rose isn't really your mom, but you know what I mean?" Michael hugged Mr. Snuggles, thinking about it. "She's like a bonus mom. Extra love, not replacement love." The changes weren't just at school. More parents had signed up for private art lessons, and the kitchen table was often surrounded by children learning to draw after school. Mrs. Rose's hands never shook during these sessions. She was too focused on teaching to remember to be nervous. "We should look for an apartment," she said one evening, counting her earnings from the lessons. "I have enough saved for a security deposit now." Michael's heart sank. His father looked up from his newspaper. "There's no rush. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." "I know, and I'm grateful. But I need to stand on my own feet again." She adjusted her new glasses. "Besides, I think the neighbors might finally be ready to accept me as just another resident." As if to prove her point, Mrs. Chun stopped by the next morning with fresh-baked cookies. "Sarah can't stop talking about the art therapy sessions," she said. "She's doing better in all her subjects now. Art helps us see things differently," Mrs. Rose explained, accepting the cookies. "Sometimes that's all we need, a new perspective." That Saturday, Michael went with his parents and Mrs. Rose to look at apartments. The first few were too expensive or too far from school. But the fourth one made Mrs. Rose pause in the doorway. It was a small studio apartment above a bookstore, with large windows that filled the space with light. The landlady, Ms. Martinez, watched as Mrs. Rose walked slowly around the room. "I understand you're a teacher?" Ms. Martinez asked. "Yes, at Lincoln Elementary. I also give private art lessons. My niece goes there." She mentioned a new art teacher who's helping kids. Ms. Martinez's eyes widened. "Oh, you're that Mrs. Rose?" Michael stepped forward protectively, but Ms. Martinez was smiling. "My niece showed me her drawings. She never liked school before, but now she can't wait to go." "So," Mrs. Rose twisted her hands nervously. "About my previous housing situation. I care about who you are now, not where you've been." Ms. Martinez handed her an application. "And from what I've heard, you're exactly the kind of tenant I want." Michael explored the apartment while the adults talked paperwork. The main room was small but bright, with built-in bookshelves along one wall. He could already imagine Mrs. Rose's art supplies organized there, her teaching materials ready for lessons. "What do you think?" Mrs. Rose asked him later, as they got ice cream to celebrate. Michael poked at his sundae. "It's nice, but I'll miss our kitchen." "Oh, sweetheart." She hugged him close. "I'll still be at your house all the time. For dinner, for lessons, for just being together. But I need my own space too. To prove to myself that I can do it. Promise you'll still make French toast sometimes?" "Every Sunday," she said firmly. "That's our tradition now." The next week was a flurry of activity. Word spread about Mrs. Rose's apartment, and suddenly the whole community mobilized. Sarah's family donated a gently used armchair. Tommy's parents, even Mrs. Peterson, contributed kitchen supplies. The art store owner offered a discount on storage units for supplies. Michael and his parents helped Mrs. Rose move in on a Saturday. There wasn't much to move. Her belongings still fit in one bag, but the apartment quickly filled with gifts from her students and their families. "Look what I made for your new home." Michael unveiled his latest drawing, a detailed sketch of their kitchen table surrounded by happy students, with Mrs. Rose teaching in the warm light from the window. "It's perfect." She hung it in the center of the largest wall. "Now I'll always have a piece of your kitchen with me." As they arranged art supplies and set up the small desk that would serve as both dining table and workspace, Michael noticed Mrs. Rose's hands trembling slightly. "Do you need juice?" he asked immediately. She smiled. "No, dear. Just feeling a bit overwhelmed." "In a good way." His mother appeared with a box of decorations. "We thought you might like these for the walls." Inside were framed copies of Mrs. Rose's teaching certificates, newspaper clippings about her art therapy program, and photos of her with her students. Old ones from Chicago and new ones from Lincoln Elementary. "My achievements," Mrs. Rose whispered, touching the frames. "I'd almost forgotten." "You never stopped being that person," Michael's father said quietly. "You just got lost for a while, and now you're found." The apartment slowly took shape. The bookshelves filled with teaching materials and art supplies. The small kitchen counter held a coffee maker, a gift from Michael's mother, and a French toast station. The windowsill bloomed with small plants from her students. As evening approached, Michael grew quieter. Mrs. Rose noticed, as she always did. "What's wrong, my brave artist?" "It's silly," he mumbled into Mr. Snuggles' fur. "Nothing you feel is silly. What if you need juice in the middle of the night? Or get scared? Or want to draw, but have no one to draw with?" Mrs. Rose sat on the new armchair and patted the space beside her. "Come here." Michael climbed up, still clutching his bear. "Do you know what the best thing is about having your own home again?" she asked. He shook his head. "It means I chose to be part of your family. Not because I had to, but because I want to. Every time I make French toast in your kitchen, every time I help with homework, every time we draw together, it's because that's where I want to be, even though you have your own place now. Especially because I have my own place now." She hugged him close. Having your own home doesn't mean being alone. It means having a safe place to return to after being with the people you love. Michael looked around the apartment, seeing it differently now. "Can I come draw with you here sometimes?" "I'm counting on it. We need to fill these walls with more art." His parents ordered pizza for dinner, and they had a picnic on the floor since the dining table hadn't arrived yet. As they ate, Mrs. Rose's students and their parents kept dropping by with more housewarming gifts, curtains, towels, a soft blanket for the armchair. The community really has changed, Michael's mother observed after the latest visitor left. They just needed to see past their fears, Mrs. Rose said. Like Michael did that first night. Later, as they prepared to leave, Michael lingered in the doorway. Are you sure you'll be okay? Mrs. Rose knelt down to his level. I have my medicine, my phone, and my art supplies. And I have you just a few blocks away. I'm more than okay. I'm home. Michael hugged her tight. Can we draw together tomorrow? Of course. And maybe we can start a new project. A story about a brave boy and his bear who helped a lost teacher find her way home. That night, in his own bed, Michael hugged Mr. Snuggles close. She's okay, right? He whispered to his bear. His mother, checking on him one last time, overheard. She's more than okay, honey. Thanks to you. I didn't do anything special, Michael protested. I just wasn't scared when I saw her eyes. That's the most special thing of all. His mother sat on the edge of his bed. You saw the person, not the situation. That's a rare gift. Michael thought about Mrs. Rose in her new apartment, surrounded by evidence of her new life. Teaching certificates and student artwork, art supplies and French toast ingredients, curtains chosen by caring neighbors, and drawings made by grateful children. Mom? Yes, baby. I'm glad our kitchen door was unlocked that night. His mother kissed his forehead. Me too. Now get some sleep. Mrs. Rose is making French toast for everyone tomorrow, remember? Michael drifted off, dreaming of warm kitchens and kind eyes, of art that healed hurting hearts, and of homes found in unexpected places. 3 months had passed since Mrs. Rose moved into her apartment above the bookstore. The morning of Lincoln Elementary's spring art fair dawned bright and clear. Michael stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie, while Mr. Snuggles watched from the bed. Ready for your speech? His mother asked from the doorway. Michael nodded, though his stomach fluttered. He was going to tell the whole school, plus all the parents and even the school board, about how art therapy had changed everything. Mrs. Rose waited for them in the school parking lot, wearing a new dress she'd bought with her teaching salary. Her hands were steady as she hugged Michael. Nervous? She asked. A little, but it's our kind of nervous, right? Right? She smiled. The kind we can draw about later. The school gymnasium had been transformed. Student artwork covered every wall, and easels displayed special pieces throughout the space. Michael's drawings had their own section, including the first superhero version of Mr. Snuggles they created on that scary night when the windows broke. Look how far you've come, Mrs. Rose said softly, comparing that first drawing to his recent works. The gymnasium filled quickly. Michael spotted Sarah Chun showing her parents her math art fusion pieces, geometric designs that helped her understand complex problems. Tommy Peterson stood proudly by his series of dog portraits, each one better than the last, healing his grief through art. Even Mrs. Peterson had come, wearing a brooch that Tommy had designed and painted himself. Principal Roberts approached the podium. Welcome to Lincoln Elementary's first Arts and Education Fair. As many of you know, this program grew from our new art therapy initiative, spearheaded by Mrs. Rose Thompson. Applause filled the gym. Mrs. Rose blushed behind her blue-framed glasses. But before we tour the exhibits, one of our students would like to say a few words. Michael. Michael walked to the podium, Mr. Snuggles clutched tight against his chest. He looked out at the sea of faces and found Mrs. Rose's eyes, still kind, still teaching, still believing in him. 3 months ago, he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger. Our school was different. Kids like me who were too shy to talk just stayed quiet. Kids like Tommy, who were sad, stayed sad. Kids like Sarah, who thought they weren't good at learning, believed they never would be. He held up Mr. Snuggles. This is my bear. He used to just help me feel brave. But Mrs. Rose showed me how to make him a superhero in my drawings. And then something magic happened. I started feeling like a superhero, too. Ripples of laughter and nodding spread through the crowd. Mrs. Rose teaches us that art isn't just about making pretty pictures. It's about seeing things differently. When I'm scared, I draw the scary thing, but make it funny. When Sarah's confused by math, she draws it until it makes sense. When Tommy missed his dog, he drew all his happy memories. Michael took a deep breath. Some people didn't want Mrs. Rose here at first, because she didn't have a home for a while. But they didn't see what I saw that night in my kitchen. They didn't see her teacher eyes, or her kind heart, or the way she could turn scary things into beautiful things. He gestured to the art-covered walls. Look around. Every drawing here tells a story. Every painting shows how someone learned to see differently. That's what Mrs. Rose taught us, that everyone has art inside them, and sometimes art is the best way to let your feelings out. Mrs. Peterson was wiping her eyes. Sarah's mother squeezed her daughter's shoulder. Tommy's father held his son's latest drawing like it was made of gold. My dad says sometimes the scariest moments bring the best changes, Michael continued. Like finding a stranger in your kitchen and discovering she's actually a teacher who changes lives. Like learning that helping someone doesn't make you poorer. It makes everyone richer. He pointed to his artwork display. See that first drawing? I made it the night some people broke our windows because they were afraid. Mrs. Rose showed me how to turn my fear into a superhero story. Now I'm not afraid anymore. None of us are. The gymnasium erupted in applause. Michael returned to his seat, where Mrs. Rose hugged him tight. You did it, she whispered. My brave artist. Principal Roberts returned to the podium. And now, I'm pleased to announce that the school board has approved full funding for our art therapy program for the next school year. Mrs. Rose will be promoted to full-time art and emotional support teacher. More applause. Michael watched Mrs. Rose's face as she absorbed the news, saw her hands remain perfectly steady as she wiped away tears of joy. The art fair became a celebration. Families moved from display to display, seeing their children's growth and healing captured in color and line. Mrs. Peterson actually hugged Mrs. Rose, apologizing through tears after seeing Tommy's progression of drawings marking his journey through grief. You've helped him in ways I couldn't, she admitted. I was so wrong about you. Sarah Chun proudly showed off her latest math scores alongside her artistic interpretations of geometry. Mrs. Rose says my brain just needs to see things differently, she explained to the school board members. And now I can see it. Michael's father found him by his superhero display. Want to know something special? He asked. What? Remember how we installed those security cameras after the window incident? Michael nodded. I checked the footage from that first night. The night Mrs. Rose came to our kitchen. Was it scary to watch? His father smiled. No, it was beautiful. This tired, scared woman found our door unlocked. And instead of taking anything, she just sat there, holding a glass of water, looking at our family photos like she was remembering something precious. And then I found her, Michael said. And then you found her. Or maybe she found us. Maybe we all found what we needed that night. Later, as families began to leave, Mrs. Rose gathered her students for a group photo. Michael stood in front. Mr. Snuggles held high, like in their victory drawing from the board meeting. Mrs. Rose? Sarah asked, can we do something special for the last day of school? What did you have in mind? Could we draw the whole year? Everything that changed. Mrs. Rose adjusted her glasses. I think that's a wonderful idea. We could make a mural. Everyone contributing their story. Like a map of how we got better, Tommy suggested. Exactly, Mrs. Rose smiled. A map of healing. After the fair, everyone gathered at Mrs. Rose's apartment for dinner. It had become a tradition. Sunday dinners at Michael's house, special celebrations in Mrs. Rose's cozy studio. The space had transformed over 3 months, walls covered in student artwork, bookshelves filled with teaching materials and art supplies, windowsills blooming with plants given by grateful parents. As the adults chatted and children drew at every available surface, Michael tugged Mrs. Rose aside. I made something for you, he said, pulling out a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a drawing, the most detailed he'd ever done. It showed Mrs. Rose both as she was now, confident teacher, beloved mentor, surrounded by students and support, and as she had been that first night, alone and cold in a dark kitchen. But the two images were connected by a bridge made of paintbrushes and pencils, drawings and hope. Oh, Michael, she hugged him close. This is perfect. It's called Finding Home, he explained, because you found a home with us, but you also helped us find a better version of home. One with more art and love and French toast. Mrs. Rose laughed through her tears. And brave boys with teddy bears, and teacher eyes that see the good stuff, even when it's hiding. They hung the drawing in a place of honor, right next to Michael's first superhero, Mr. Snuggles. Past and present, fear and hope, loneliness and family, all connected by art, by courage, by the simple power of seeing with kind eyes and an open heart. Later that night, as the party wound down, Michael found Mrs. Rose in her usual spot by the window, drawing in her sketchbook. "What are you making?" he asked, climbing onto the armchair beside her. She showed him the sketch, their whole extended family, not just his parents and Mrs. Rose, but Sarah and Tommy and all the other students, all the parents who had learned to see differently, even Mrs. Peterson with her new understanding. In the center stood a small boy with a bear, bridging the gap between fear and love, between closed doors and open hearts. "This is us now," she said softly. "All of us together, better than being alone in a cold kitchen." "Oh, my dear," she hugged him close. "So much better. You know, some people search their whole lives for a place to belong. I had to lose everything to find mine." Michael yawned, sleepy from the long day. "Mom says sometimes you have to let go of what you think you need to make room for what you really need. Your mother is very wise." Mrs. Rose adjusted his tie, now crooked from the long day. "And you, my brave artist, are the wisest of all." "Why?" "Because you saw past all the scary parts to the heart of things. You saw me, not my circumstances. You taught an entire community how to see with better eyes." Michael smiled, drifting off against her shoulder. "That's because I learned from the best teacher ever." As the sun set outside Mrs. Rose's window, painting the sky in colors they would probably draw tomorrow, the apartment filled with the soft sounds of family, conversations and laughter, children planning their next art projects, parents sharing stories of transformation. Mrs. Rose held her sleeping student, her hands steady and sure, her heart full of the kind of riches that no hardship could ever take away. On the wall, superhero Mr. Snuggles watched over them all, guarding this new kind of family built on courage and creativity, on second chances and French toast, on the simple truth that sometimes the scariest moments bring the most beautiful changes, if only we have the courage to see with kind eyes and open hearts.